By the time the sun reached the middle of the sky, the elephants had turned the bridge into a wall. Engines idled at both ends. Heat shimmered over windshields and metal roofs. Drivers leaned forward over steering wheels, staring at the gray backs and flapping ears that filled the span from rail to rail. No one dared push the line of vehicles closer. The herd had stepped onto the bridge, walked almost to the center, and stopped. No trumpet, no panic, no stampede. Just a full, deliberate halt that felt more like a decision than a delay. At the front stood the matriarch. Her tusks were short and thick, worn by years of use. The skin around her eyes had the fine creases of age. Her ears moved slowly, like big, careful hands testing the air. Every few seconds, she lifted her trunk and hovered it above the concrete, not sniffing at the cars, not at the humans, not at the metal railings. She kept tasting the space between her feet and the water below. The bridge itself was not old. It had been poured and bolted in place a little more than a decade earlier, when the region decided it wanted more tourism and a faster route to the distant city. Before that, the only crossing had been a narrow, rusting structure further downstream and an old seasonal ford upstream that elephants and people had shared in alternating months. The ford had fallen out of use when the river changed. At least, that was how most people told the story. They said the new hydro project and the shifts in rain had made the water too unpredictable. They blamed distant hills, far-off policy, or bad luck, depending on who was speaking. The bridge didn't care. It took the weight of trucks and buses and motorcycles without comment, concrete and steel answering to load and stress charts, not gossip. From above, the river looked calm. It moved in slow folds between pale stones and dark pools. Trees leaned over it in some places, throwing shade. In others, the banks were bare and hard, scoured by past floods. The surface held the colors of the sky. Blue when the day was clear. Brown when the rain had passed through freshly turned earth. Today, it looked like something between the two. Sunlight made a broken path down the center of the channel. To a tired driver, the water might have seemed almost inviting. A place to splash a face, to cool a bottle, to take a picture. To the elephants, it did not smell that way. The first hint for the humans had not been sight or scent, but data. Weeks before the herd stepped onto the bridge, a junior technician in the regional water office had watched a different kind of alarm blink on a screen. The river that flowed under the bridge also fed intake pipes that ran toward a cluster of towns downriver. Those towns had taps and pipes and storage tanks, and the office near the capital liked to see graphs showing that everything in those tanks was safe. Most days, the lines on the screen moved within expected ranges. Conductivity, pH, turbidity. Words that meant very little to anyone outside the field and almost everything to the people inside it. The technician sat in a room lined with humming equipment, watching for spikes. On a late evening, one line inched out of its usual band. Not a dramatic jump. No sharp stabbing peak that would trigger immediate alerts. Just a slow, stubborn climb in the measure that suggested there was more dissolved in the water than there had been last month. She had sent a note to her supervisor. Her supervisor had looked at the graphs, frowned, and opened older files. There were seasonal patterns. There were known discharges from small industries upstream. There were times when storms carried ash and soil. The numbers could fit into those categories if someone wanted them to. The supervisor had asked for a follow-up. Sampling teams had gone to the obvious places. The old textile plant, the sugar mill, the drainage ditch that everyone pretended did not exist. They had found small violations and issued polite warnings. Fines would follow. Meetings would be scheduled. The line on the graph did not go back down. It did not climb fast enough to make a crisis. It simply drifted higher and stayed there, as if the river had swallowed something it could not spit out. No one on those calls mentioned the new waste storage ponds near the foothills, because officially those ponds were lined and sealed and monitored, and the reports from that project said there was no leak. On the ground, along the elephant corridor, another set of routines played out. The herd had used the same path longer than any map had been in print. It moved like a memory through the dry forest and thin fields, tracing a line between feeding grounds, salt licks, and shade. Rangers knew its general route. Farmers knew it too well. Roads crossed that route in a few places, and at each crossing there were stories. The new bridge had become part of one of those stories. Vehicles used it every day. People with cameras stopped at the lookout points and aimed down, hoping to catch an eagle, a crocodile, or at least a reflection. Trucks carrying fuel, food, and cement thumped over the expansion joints. At night, the bridge lamps cast pools of yellow over concrete and railings, making the river look like a strip of polished metal. Elephants seldom needed the structure. They preferred shallow places where their feet could feel the riverbed. But fences, new fields, and a resort that had claimed an old ford had changed the path. Bit by bit, the easiest way between two shrinking pockets of forest now passed close to the concrete mouth of the bridge. At first, the elephants had walked under it, in the narrow margin between abutment and bank. Monsoon seasons and human building changed that too. Embankments grew steeper. Service roads appeared near the piers. Half-built walls and piles of stone narrowed the passage. The herd tested alternate routes, found wire and noise, and circled back. Eventually, following their own judgment and the quiet signals of the oldest cow, they tried the wide, flat strip where everyone else went. The first time they crossed the bridge, it had been at dawn. The surface was cool. No vehicles were moving. Their feet had echoed slightly on the concrete. The river beneath had smelled of mud and fish and old leaves. They had not hesitated. Years later, on the day the bridge turned into a wall, the smell was different. It carried something sharp and wrong, hidden under familiar layers like a thin, bitter thread in an otherwise comforting cloth. The calves sensed it as discomfort. The younger adults sensed it as unease. The matriarch sensed it as a stop. She had set one foot on the painted center line, lifted her trunk, and pulled the air over the sensitive membranes at its end. Then she had turned her head slightly, listening to something that no human register recorded. Behind her, the line of gray bodies compressed, then steadied. The herd trusted her. When she halted, they halted. The first car to meet them had been small. The driver had seen their shapes ahead, slowed, and stopped at a respectful distance. There was a kind of awe in seeing elephants fill a human road. It made the mind step back from horn and schedule. For a few minutes, he had simply watched, windows down, radio off, listening to their low rumbles and the rustle of trunks and tails. He had expected them to move on. They did not. A truck came up behind his car, brakes sighing. Another vehicle appeared on the far side of the bridge, also slowing. People got out, then got back in as the heat rolled over them. Someone took a photo. Someone else made a small video and sent it to a friend in the valley, where the signal was better. The picture and the video moved faster than the official channels. By the time a ranger station picked up the call from the traffic police, several dozen people in the towns below already knew that elephants had taken the bridge. The ranger who answered the official call had spent more than half his life watching people and animals argue over space. He had seen what happened when trucks pushed too close to wild bodies. He had seen what happened when hungry herds pushed too close to crops. He had watched the thin strip of land along the river become a corridor that was too narrow and too noisy for comfort, and he had tried to draw lines on maps that could convince both sides to share. The words on the phone were familiar. Herd on the road, blocking traffic, need to move them. He took his team in a crate of firecrackers that made loud pops without starting fires. There were protocols, and he followed them. The drive up twisted through dry forest and cut banks. Dust followed the truck like a loyal ghost. When a person der a winder reached the bridge approach, they parked among the waiting vehicles and stepped out into the thick heat. The sight pressed the breath out of his chest for a moment. The elephants filled the span in a straight, unmoving line. The matriarch stood at the front, her body still but taut, trunk lifting and lowering in small, deliberate arcs. The rest of the herd was arranged behind her in a pattern that was not random. Calves in the safest pockets, young bulls at the flanks, other cows giving the leader a small circle of free space. They were not grazing. They were not resting. They were listening. The ranger had seen them in panic, with eyes rolled and ears out, and in joy, splashing in mud. This was neither. This was the posture of animals that had sensed something invisible on a wind that tasted normal to human tongues. He moved to the side of the bridge and looked down. From that angle, the river showed more of itself. The surface near the piers rippled over darker patches that did not match the usual pattern of stone and shadow. Faint, light brown streaks feathered out from an unseen point upstream, as if someone had drawn invisible lines and the water had only partially erased them. He had no instruments to tell him what those colors meant. He did have a memory. As a child, he had drunk from streams without thinking. As a young recruit, he had been warned off certain pools downstream from the old factories, told to boil everything, told to wait. He had seen fish floats in the shallows once after a clandestine release of something oily and bright. The river below looked nothing like that disaster. It looked almost ordinary, which was worse. A wrong that hid inside normal was harder to name. The ranger walked back to the waiting truck and called the number he used only when matters went beyond fences and fines. The voice on the other end belonged to the same supervisor who had frowned at the rising line on a screen weeks earlier. The call turned that frown into a decision. The decision moved through offices and dispatch desks. A vehicle with sampling gear was sent, along with a hydrologist who had already been worrying about unnamed changes. While they drove, the elephants held their ground. Cars turned around and sought other routes. Buses backed away with careful, grinding movements. Trucks remained. Some could not afford the fuel to try a long detour. Some could not spare the time. A fuel tanker parked far back, driver tense at the idea of being so close to so much mass and unpredictability. The herd ignored the lines of metal and rubber. From time to time, a calf shifted its weight, leaning gently against a sibling. A young bull flapped his ears and shook his head, fighting against boredom and the urge to push forward. The matriarch kept them where they were with small sounds and small movements that never quite became steps. When the hydrologist arrived, she did not go to the bridge first. She went upstream. In her mind, the river was not the strip beneath the concrete alone. It was the whole length of water and stone and channel that led to that point. She followed the dirt track that service vehicles used, passing the old abandoned ford, the outfall pipes that she already knew, the bend where erosion had carved a new bank last year. At a particular curve, a faint chemical tang met the usual smells of silt and algae. On the far bank, half hidden behind a strip of scrub, a small drainage cut sneaked its way to the river. It had not been on her map. No permit had been filed for it. The soil around its mouth was discolored in a pattern that matched the streaks she had seen under the bridge from photographs sent by the ranger. She sampled: water into bottles, sediment into jars, notes in a book, GPS coordinates tagged. Each act was small on its own. Together, they turned suspicion into evidence. Back at the bridge, she took more samples from the slow eddies near the piers and from the mid-channel, careful to catch both the clearer water and the cloudy lines. The matriarch watched her from above with one calm, heavy gaze. As the day wore on, the shadows under the bridge shifted and stretched. The heat rose, then began to soften. The elephants did not move forward or back. They held the span as if it were part of their skin. At the water office in the city, machines whirred and hummed. The first tests were basic. Numbers confirmed what the technicians' graphs had whispered. The river carried more dissolved solids than it should, and the change was coming from upstream of the bridge. Other analyses took longer. Filters clogged, colors changed in test vials, chemical signatures lined up with certain kinds of waste. The office had a protocol for that too. Intake points downstream were throttled back. A different reservoir was brought online to supply some of the towns. The flow under the bridge continued, but less of it found its way into kitchen taps and school faucets, while people higher up the chain decided what to say and when. On the ridge, the elephants knew nothing about graphs or valves. They knew that the water below held something their bodies did not accept. By late afternoon, the ranger decided that the herd needed somewhere else to stand. Muscles and feet had their limits. Calves would tire. Nervous humans would try things he did not want them to try. The matriarch had made her point. Now he had to find a compromise between honoring it and keeping everyone safe. He walked slowly toward her, staying near the bridge rail. He kept his posture small, his movements predictable. He carried no firecrackers in his hands, no sticks. His voice stayed low, even though he knew she did not understand the words. He did not ask her to cross. He suggested, with distance and angle and patience, that the herd move backward, away from the center, back the way they had come. That they let the bridge be empty again. It took time. Elephants did not like to go back without reason. Their stories moved forward through space. But the matriarch had already understood that the path ahead was wrong, and she sensed no threat from the path behind. With small nudges of shoulder and trunk, she began to rotate her great body. One by one, The others followed. The line unraveled into a curve, then into a slow retreat. Dusty feet stepped onto tarmac, then onto the packed earth of the approach, then onto the narrower road that led back into the trees. Drivers held their breath as the wall turned into a moving river of gray. When the last swinging tail disappeared between the trunks, the bridge lay empty in the falling light, concrete still holding the echo of their weight. Traffic did not resume immediately. The hydrologist, the ranger, and the local road officer spoke in the polite but firm language of risk. There were checks to make. There was air to clear. There were instructions from higher up that did not yet have words in public. For a few hours, the span remained closed. That evening, clouds gathered over the hills. Far upstream, the same hidden drainage ditch continued to feed its unwanted contribution into the current. But the people responsible for it now had inspectors at their gate and notices on their desks. Excuses would be written. Lawyers would make arguments. Fixes would be demanded. In the weeks that followed, engineers traced the path of the leak back to its source. A waste pond liner that had never been installed properly. A monitoring sensor that had been bypassed to avoid inconvenient numbers. A chain of small, quiet decisions that had assumed no one would ever look too closely at a thin, out-of-the-way stream. The company involved paid fines and replaced pipes. The environmental team scraped and treated soil, watching the downstream graphs like doctors watching a fever break. The line on the screen that had drifted upward slowed, then settled, then began to lean back toward its old place. In the valley, the towns noticed only a short period of strange taste in water and a brief bulletin asking them to boil from backup supplies until further notice. On the rangers' maps, a new mark appeared near the bridge. Not an official symbol, just a small handwritten note that said the elephants had turned there for a reason. Future patrols would remember that. Future route planning meetings would have one more detail to consider when someone suggested moving the herd's corridor closer to the river for convenience. The matriarch led her family across other fords in other seasons. They found side channels where the water still smelled right, places where bedrock rose close to the surface and the stones kept cold even in hot months. They stepped through brown floodwater and clear dry season flow, reading information in scent and vibration that instruments would later confirm when someone bothered to check. Months later, when authorities declared the water safe again, people asked whether the elephants would cross the bridge now that the problem had been fixed. Some part of the answer lay in the slow unwinding of habit and experience that lived inside memory thicker than any report. The first time the herd came back along that path after the repairs, the bridge waited ahead with its clean white lines and its smooth gray surface. The river beneath moved with a sound that matched older years. The matriarch approached the concrete mouth and paused. She raised her trunk, tasted the air, listened to vibrations in the soles of her feet. Behind her, the younger elephants shifted, waiting for the pattern they knew. After a long moment, she turned not onto the bridge, but down a side track that rangers had quietly opened and kept clear. It led to a broad, shallow place downstream, where gravel crunched underfoot and the banks were low. She chose the riverbed over the concrete. The water there held the smell of stone and leaves and distance, without the bitter thread that had stopped her before. Calves splashed cautiously, older animals walked with slow certainty. On the ridge above, the bridge remained a tool for engines and schedules. Under it, the river carried its mixed cargo of rain and runoff and memory. The line on the technician's screen stayed within its proper band. Reports were filed and archived. Names were written and replaced in organizational charts. For the channel between forest blocks, the real crossing lay where elephant feet met water and stone. For the people who knew the story, the image that stayed was simple. A herd of elephants filling a human bridge, refusing to move forward over a river that, to most eyes, looked harmless. A matriarch who trusted what her body told her more than the shapes poured by machines. A small moment of stillness that forced humans to stop long enough to see what the water had been trying to say through numbers and faint smells and changed reflections. The disaster that did not happen never made a headline. No hospital reports of strange illnesses from downriver taps. No fish kill in the shallows. No late-night meeting where someone had to explain why the river was suddenly off-limits. Instead, there was a scar on a company's balance sheet, a few pages in a filing cabinet, a new rule about monitoring, and a quiet note on a ranger's map that said elephants had once stopped at a bridge and refused a river that was not what it seemed. The next time the technician at the water office saw an odd drift on a graph, she remembered that story. She requested a sample sooner. And far away, under a sky the color of wet steel or dry dust. Depending on the day, a line of gray bodies moved along an old route, led by a mind and a nose that did not need charts to know when something in the world it trusted had changed.